So, Rabbi Sai, we are on DAF Tes Amud Aleph today, and we're up to, it's about the 8th line in the Gemara, 7th or 8th line. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara had been discussing the sort of the revolving door policy that existed in the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. When it came to the Kahuna Gedola, when it came to the Kohanim Gedolim, there was a constant rotation. Just about every year there was a new Kohen Gadol because of corruption. They would go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur and they wouldn't survive. So, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mai Dichsiv, Yiras Hashem Tosif Yamim Ushnos Rishoim Tiktzarna. What does the pasuk mean in Mishlei when it says that the fear of God will increase days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened? That pasuk is a reference to the following: Yiras Hashem Tosif Yamim Zamikdash Rishon. The fear of God shall increase days. That refers to the status of what existed in the times of the first temple. She'amad arba meos ve'eser shanim, v'loshim shubo eliyud ches kohanim gedolim. During the first temple stood for 410 years. And during that over 4-century long period, there were only 18 Kohen Gadol that served. So when you think about you think about averages, was about 22 years or something like that of Kohanim Gedolim. Each Kohen Gadol would have about a 22-year reign. That's not a bad tenure. It's like more than Stephen Harper. Okay. Ushnos Rishayim Tiktzarna Zem Mikdasheni. And the years of the wicked shall be shortened. This refers to the second temple. Sha'ama dalad meos ve'esrim shana v'shim shubo yosem mishalosh meos kohanim. That the second temple was almost just a little bit longer than the first, 420 years. And yet there were more than 300 kohanim gedolim who served. Now, say mehem mem shana shishime shimon hatzadik ushmonim shishime yochanan kohen gadol. You have to subtract from those 420 years, right off the bat, take off 40 from the time that Shimon HaTzadik was the Kohen Gadol, and the 80 years that Rabbi Yochanan, that Yochanan Kohen Gadol was the Kohen Gadol. So you've got to take off 120 years already off of the 420, now you got you down to 300. And then Esther Shishime Shishmol ben Pabi Vamrilo Yadalef Shishime Shrabaloza ben Charsam. Then take off another 10 years, and some say 11 years, either for Yishmol ben Pabi or Rebbelozer ben Charsam, who are also the Kohanim Gedolim, and you're left with a deficit. You're left with less than 300 years. Mikan va'elech tzeva chashov kol echad v'echad lahotzi shenaso. And based on that, you see that most of the Kohanim Gedolim of the Second Temple did not even make it a year.
Rabbi,
yeah.
Most of them, he paid off the Greek governor, whatever, and they became Kohen Gadol.
That's right.
And somebody else bid him.
That's right. So anyway, if you take a look at the Hagos Habach, he has an additional girsi here, probably that he gets from the Ein Yaakov, and it says, thank you so much, Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta v'chol kach lama. Why was it their tenure so short? Lefi shahayu lokchin osa b'damim, because they were on the take. They paid for this honor. And it wasn't based on a meritocracy, it was based on a dollarocracy, whatever you want to say. Right? The Amar Rebbe Asi, Tarkaba de Dinri, Aila Le, Marta Bas Baitus Lianai Malka, Adu-ukme Yehoshua ben Gamla Bekohani Ravravi. That Marta ben Baitos, Bat Baitos was a matron in the times of the Second Temple, a very wealthy woman, and she gave Yanai the king a chest full of dinars in order to get Rabbi Shua ben Gamla to be the Kohen Gadol. Now, Rabbi Shua ben Gamla is one of the best of the bad Kohanim Gedolim. The Mishnah even mentions him in a virtuous way, but at the same time, he bought his way into the Kahuna, and that's why he's mentioned in this context. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta mipnei ma chorva Shiloh. So now that we're talking about the difference between the first and second temples, we're going to go off on a tangent and discuss the various temples and the sins that were extant during their respective times. We're going to start with Mishkan Shiloh, which was also destroyed, if I'm not mistaken, by the Plishtim in the times of Shmuel Hanavi. That had been standing as the precursor to the two temples, and it was in Shiloh. What sin was it that caused for it to be destroyed or taken into captivity? So, mipnei shahayu bo shnei dvarim, that there were two sins, gili arayas ubizayim kachim, licentiousness and the desecration of the sacrificial things. Gili arayas Dichsiv ve'eli zakein ma'od v'shama es kol asher yasun banav l'chol Yisrael v'es asher yishkoben es hanoshim atzovos pesach ol moed. Eli hears, he's quite elderly, this is in Shmuel Aleph in Perek Beis, and he hears all that his sons have done to all of Israel and how they lay with women who would appear at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Now, what that means is, at face value, is shocking. However, the Gemara says, "Va'afal gav da Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yochanan kol ha'omer b'nei Eli chatu eino elatoyeh." He says, even though the rabbis explained that that's not to be taken literally, it's not that literally they did this heinous act, but rather mitoch sheshahu eschinehem miha male aleya nakasuv ki'ilu shachvum. That what they used to do is they were very arrogant people and pompous. The sons of Eli, they thought that they were the God's gift to mankind, and so they took their time when it came to taking people's karbanos. And when a woman would show up, they would treat her, you're not important, you can wait. And they kept people waiting, sometimes even for days. And as a result, if a woman had to bring a korban for tahara purposes, or she had just had a child, or whatever it was, they told her, you can wait. We're going to take our time. And as a result, this caused them to delay in returning home to their husbands. And this caused them to cease, to delay procreation. And that's why the scripture says it's as if they committed adultery, because they deprived these women of their family life. So that's what their sin was. And now we're going to bring a long series of psukim to indicate this. So that we already did. And now we're going to talk about Bizay and Kodshim. They desecrated Kodshim. How do we see that? Dirsiv, and there's a long quote here, I'll just read the whole thing. Gam b'terem yaktirin es hachelev uba na'ar hakohen v'amar le'isha zoveach tena basar litzlos lekohen v'lo yikach mimcha basar mevushal ki imchai v'yomer elav ha'ish kator yaktirun ki yom hachelev v'kach lecha kasher teveh nafshecha v'amar lo ki atotitein v'im lo lakachti b'chazka v'tihi chatas ha'ne'orim gedola me'odes b'nei Hashem ki niatzu ha'noshim es minchas Hashem. So this is a very long quote from Sefer Shmuel, but it's the same chapter in 1 Samuel 2, and basically what the story is like this. These same sons of Eli, or their family, whatever it was, you found that originally the pasuk says the practice was that what you'd give to the Kohen was that after let's say you brought a korban shlamim and you'd want to cook it, you'd cook it in the environs of the temple, or the temple mount, and you'd have a pot with a stew of meat, pieces of meat from your korban. The practice was that a Kohen would take a big fork, he would put it inside the pot and pull out whatever piece of meat was, and that would belong to him, and that he could take home. That was his, that was his take of the korban. The Bnei Eli changed the policy. They said, no, that's insufficient. People like us, we deserve more. So you see, like even a youth would go over to a person who brought his korban and say, we want not just a cooking piece of meat, we want a cut of prime beef before it's even cooked. You give it right to us now. And the man would say, but you didn't even offer the fats on the mizbeach yet. Give us a chance. Do your job first, and then we'll give you a cut. And they said, no, give it to us now, and if not, we're going to take it by force. And this was a terrible abuse of power that was taking place in the times of the base of the Mishkan Shiloh. This was a bizayon kachim, and they blasphemed against the sacrifices of God, is what the pasuk says. Okay, so now that's Mishkan Shiloh. We see the corruption that was extant in those days. Mikdash Rishon mipnei macharev. Why was the first temple destroyed? So the famous Gemara mipnei Gimel Dvarim shayu bo avodah zarah gilui arayos u'shvichus damim. Idolatry, licentiousness, and murder. Avodah zarah dichsiv ki katzar hamatzah mehistareya. The pasuk says that the cushion or the bed is too short, unable to stretch out. So what does that mean? What does that mean? And then the second part of the pasuk is Bahamasechat Sarah Behiskanes. And it says that the Masecha, which could mean a number of different things, but as we'll see, the Gemara will translate it as like Elohei Masecha. Molten images are too short to bring in. So, my Katzar Hamatzami Histareh. What does the first part of the pasuk mean? That the cushion is too short. Amar Rabbi Yonasan Katzar Matzah Zeh Histarer Alav Shnei Reim Ke'echad. He says the bed is too narrow to allow two people to lie in it at the same time. What basically HaKadosh Baruch Hu says is that since Menachem, the wicked king of the first temple, brought in idols into the temple, God says there's not room enough. This town ain't big enough for the two of us. There's no room for idolatry. You got to choose which God, but I can't stay here anymore, says the Ribono Shel Olam, if you're going to bring in other gods. So that the second part of the pasuk now makes sense, that the Masecha, the false god, it's too short to be able, in other words, there's not enough room to bring in both. You can't bring God and idolatry into the same place. So Reb Shmuel Bar Nachmani Kimati Reb Yonasan Lahikra, when Reb Yonasan would arrive to that pasuk, Bachi, he would cry, Amar man dichsiv bekones kaneid mehayam, that about God it says that He is so huge, He is so all-encompassing, that He can gather all of the water of the ocean into one little flask of His, and yet na'ases lo masechat tzara, that yet this molten image, this idol, creates too small of a space for God to fit. Too small of a space, God doesn't have room, right? In other words, it's how can God be displaced by such a nothing of an item, right? So now we go on. Gili Arayas, licentiousness. D'chsiv Vayomer Hashem Yan ki gavu benos Tzion batelachnu netuyos garon. That God says, and this is a pasuk now in Yeshaya, right? It talks about the sins of the daughters of Zion. They were haughty, and they walked with an outstretched neck. Umisakro seinayim, and they give a gaze of. We'll see what the misakros means over here. Haloch v'tafof telachna. They walk with tafof, and we'll see what that means also. Uveraglehen te'akasna, and they anger with their feet. So what does the first part of the pasuk mean? Ya'an ki gavu benos Tzion, that the daughters of Zion are haughty. Shahayu mahalchos arucha b'tzad kitzara, that they used to walk. A tall girl would deliberately walk with a short girl to accentuate her beauty, to accentuate her tallness. You know, there's a joke that comedians say today: if you want to get picked up at a dance club, right, just go out with a bunch of ugly girls, and so by comparison, you'll look pretty, right? That's what they tell girls to do today, right? So it's the same kind of abuse of another person. You know, I'm of average height. Let me take a short girl. We'll walk together, and that way people will think I'm tall, right? So that's in itself that's a terrible kind of action. But telachnu netuyos garon, they would walk with outstretched necks. Shahiu mahalchos b'koma zukufa. They would walk with a haughty, upright posture. Umisakros einayim. What does that word misakros mean? Dahabu malyin kuchla inehen. They would fill their eyes with cosmetics. In other words, try to doll themselves up, as they say. Haloch v'tafof telachno, walking with tafof. What does tafof mean? Shahiu ma'alchos ekev b'tzad godel, that they would, tafof comes from the word to align very carefully. They would make sure that they walked with tremendous deliberation to make sure that their walking was in such a way that it would be attractive, right? So they would place their heel right in front of the big toe of the other foot, and that's how they train themselves to walk. Uviraglehen tiakasna, and they would anger with their feet. What does that mean? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak shayu mevios mor v'afar simon umenichos b'min alehen. What they used to do is they would bring these fragrances, place them in in their heel of their shoe, and then umahalchos b'shuke Yerushalayim, they would walk in the marketplaces of Jerusalem. V'cheshemagios etzel bachure Yisrael boatos umetizos aleihem umachnisin b'hen yetzer hara ke'eres shalachna. That when they would pass by the yeshiva bachers, they would stamp with their feet so that the perfume in their shoes would profuse and emit this fragrance, and the boys would smell it. They would get a yetzer hara, like a snake's venom in them, and it would get the best of them, and that's how things started to go downhill. Now that's okay, so therefore you see that the daughters of Israel were acting in an improper fashion during the times of the first temple.
It's not exactly sneers, but on the other hand, why is it a riot? It's not, I mean, what we would normally classify as a riot.
Well, it's a very good point. is that the Gemara is trying to point out that even though it wasn't mamish gili arayas, they did acts that would eventually lead to that. So, okay. In today's world, they'd say, put it on the resume. Put it in your photo, right? Put it in your photo and send it, with all dollied up and with the different postures. So are we so much different from what they did back then? Anyway. Okay. I don't know, maybe Kosher Tube will erase that. Shvichus damim, murder. Dichsiv, as it says in the Pasuk, Begam dam naki shafach, menashe harbe ma'od, ad asher milayas Yerushalayim pelapeh. That the Pasuk says that Menashe, the evil idolatrous king, was also involved with murder. And it says in the book of Menachem that he spilled so much innocent blood that Jerusalem was filled with blood from end to end. So that's what the Gemara now says. There's a bit of a problem with the Girsa here, but we're going to just read it plainly, and we won't use the Bach at this point. So the second temple did not possess those things. They had gemachs, they had yeshivas, they had everything was great, right? So then why was the second temple destroyed? There was no avodah zarah, there was no gili arayas, there was no shvichas damim, because there was senseless hatred. This is to teach you that sinas chinam is weighted like all of those three cardinal sins of avodah zarah, gili arayas, and shvichas damim. So now the Gemara goes back to the first temple, and this is where the Girsa gets a little bit off, right? There must be some words here that have to be inserted, but the Gemara is now going back to the first temple discussion, and it tells us that Rishoyim hayu, that the people of the first temple were wicked. They did wicked things. Ela shetalu bitchonim beHakadosh Baruch Hu, but they placed their trust in the Ribbon Shalom. That was sort of like their saving grace, is that they recognized God, and they said, the Eibishter helfen, right? Even though they knew that they were doing Averis. Asan l'mikdash rishon dichsiv, that's a reference to the first temple, that says about it, Rasheha b'shochad yishbotu, v'chohaneha b'mechir yoru, u'nevieha b'kesef yiksomu. So even though their leaders take bribes, their kohanim are on the take, their Nevi'im divine for money, and yet Ba'al Hashem Yishanu Le'mor, but they still rely on the Ribbono Shel Olam. They place their trust in God, it says in Micha, and they say, Halo Hashem b'kirbeinu lo savo aleinu ra, that God is in our midst, nothing bad will befall us. And because at least they acknowledge that God was in their midst, Leficha Chevi Alein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Gimel Gezeros Kineged Gimel Averos Shebiyadam. God brings upon them three punishments to correspond to the three sins that they did. In other words, there's a ambivalence. On the one hand, their crimes were heinous. They did terrible things. But at the same time, they acknowledged that God was in their midst. So therefore, God gives them very clear midah kineged midah punishment to indicate to them you're being punished in three ways for the three sins that you committed. Lochein biglalchem, and therefore the pasuk says, and this is a pasuk in Micha, it says, Tzion Sadeh Techerash, that Zion will be plowed over as a field. The Yerushalayim Ayintia, Yerushalayim shall become like a flat land. And Vahar Habayis Lebamos Yar, and the Temple Mount shall become like a forest. Now, it's very unclear as to how these three punishments correspond to the three cardinal sins, but that goes a little bit beyond our discussion for DAF Yomi today, but it's certainly worth an analysis. So now the Gemara says, you mean to tell me that sinas chinam was only in the second temple? It didn't exist in the first temple? Ba'aksiv migurei el cherev hayu esami, lachein sfok al yareich. This is a pasuk in Yechezkel, and it says that there is fighting or provocation to the sword was my nation, and therefore clap in mourning on your thigh. V'amar Rabbi Lazar, Elu b'nei Adam she'ochlin v'shosin zeh im zeh, v'dokrin zeh ezeh v'charvo shebelashonam. That this refers to people in the first temple, as Yechezkel was referring to. They would sit down and eat with each other and would stab each other with their tongues. Now, what that means is that people would pretend that they were friends, but then they would take barbs at each other. Oh, Yankel, it's so good to see you. You look wonderful for a fellow of your condition. You look wonderful for, and then they would look at like a backhanded compliment that would make the person, they would stab people with, use insults in order to harm people. So obviously there was sinas chinam. So the Gemara says, how do you reconcile that? Hahi b'nesiya Yisrael havai. That was only with the leaders. The leaders, the rabbinic leaders, were the ones who were taking barbs at each other, but the rest of the nation was b'shalom. Dichsiv za'ak v'hilel ben Adam ki hihaisa ba'ami. And because the pasuk says Za'ak v'Hillel, that cry and Hillel, like not really praise in this case, but sort of to cry out, because this was in my nation. So V'tanya Za'ak v'Hillel ben Adam Yochel L'chol Tamalomar Hi B'chol Nesiyei Yisrael, as the pasuk says in Yechezkel, and as the Brisa accentuates that it took place among the Nesiyei Yisrael, the leaders. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar Damri to Ravaya Rishonim Sheniskala Avonim Niskala Kitzam Achronim Shaloniskala Avonim Lo Niskala Kitzam. So they say as follows. They say that it's true that the sins of the first temple were great, but because their sins were overt, the end of their diaspora was overt as well. They were told exactly when their diaspora, their gullus, would end, and it ended at an exposed time. However, the people of the second temple, their sinas chinam was not as visible, and therefore the end of their gullus is not visible. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Tovat Tzipornim Shal Rishonim Mikresin Shal Achronim. In the same vein, Rabbi Yochanan says, better the fingernail of the early ones than the bellies of the second ones, meaning that people of the first temple, despite their heinous crimes, were better than the people of the second temple. So Amalei Reish Lakish Adarabba Achronim Adifi Afal Gav Dika Shibud Malchios Ka'aski B'Torah. Reish Lakish says, how can you say that? The people of the second diaspora, look, you see, even though they're being subjugated, they're still learning Torah. Look how committed we are as Yidden of the Galus. So Amalei Bira Tochiach Shechazar Lishonim V'Lo Chazar La'Achronim. So Rabbi Yochanan said back to him, no, look at the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash came back eventually for the people of the first diaspora, but it hasn't come back yet for the people of the second diaspora. So you see that the people of the second diaspora, whatever you're going to say about their Talmud Torah, it's great, it's gewaldic, it's tremendous, but we don't have a second temple. We don't have a third temple, I should say. Shalu is Rabbi Elazar, Rishonim Gedolim or Achronim Gedolim. They asked Rabbi Elazar in the same vein, who was greater, the people of the first or the second diaspora? Amar Lahem Tenuei Nechem Bebira. He said, look at the Bira, look at the Beis HaMikdash. You see that the first diaspora got back their Beis HaMikdash. The people of the second diaspora did not get back their Beis HaMikdash. Ika da Amri, some say that it wasn't a Nechem that he said, but rather Amrle a Dechem Bebira. Look at the testimony. Your testimony or your witness is the Beis HaMikdash. If it's not here, it means that the second diaspora is worse. Reish Lakish Avisachi Biyardena. Asa Rabba Bar Barchana Yahav Leyada. So Reish Lakish was once swimming in the Jordan River. Rabbi Bar Barchana, who's a Babylonian sage, must have been visiting Eretz Yisrael at the time, and he's walking by the riverbank, and he sees the great Reish Lakish swimming, and he extends him a hand and says, Rebbe, would you like to come out of the water? So Amar Lei Eloka Sanina Luchu. Reish Lakish says to him, God hates you. And he says you in the plural. He wasn't referring specifically to Rabbi Bar Barchana, he was referring to Babylonian Jews. He says God hates the Jews of the exile, because Dichsiv im chomahi nivna aleha tiras kesef v'im delas hi natsur aleha luach erez. The pasuk in Shir Hashirim says, if she is a wall, my sister, we shall build for her a tiras kesef, a barrier, a protective barrier of silver. If she is a delis, we shall protect her with this plank or door made out of cedar wood, meaning that we're going to create a protective barrier either made out of silver or out of wood, out of cedar wood. And what is the pasuk coming to teach? Imasisem atzmechem kechoma va'alisem kulchem b'mei Ezra nimshaltem kekesef. If you would have made yourselves like a wall, meaning that just like a wall has no breaches, if you would have en masse locked hand in hand every single Jew of the Babylonian exile, and would have come together en masse to build the second temple, then you would have been like silver, she'ein rekev shalit bo, that does not decompose, is not subject to any kind of rot. But achshav she'alisam b'kedalsos nimshaltem ke'erez she'harekev sholet bo. But because you didn't come up like a wall, but rather like a series of doors, which means that there were gaps in between the Jews who came up, meaning that you didn't come up en masse. There were scattered Jews who came up, but not everyone came up to build the second temple. That's why the rot can infiltrate the Jews of the second temple.
And this is fine, but he's giving Musar to, this is after the destruction.
He's giving Musar to a man who wasn't even remotely connected historically to the
500 years
to the Babylonian exile. It's hundreds of years later.
Not only is it 100 years after the second one, it's hundreds of years after they didn't
Absolutely,
come back.
absolutely. So what he's basically saying is that God hates the Jews of the diaspora. Because right, it's all your fault, and not only that, but he's saying tachlis, you should make aliyah. Tachlis, you should make aliyah. What are you doing in the Gullus? You should make aliyah. Look at what your ancestors, so to speak, your forebears of the Babylonian exile, look at what they were responsible for. So my erez. So the question now is, what do we mean by a cedar wood that is subject to rot? So Amar Ula Sasamgor. There's a certain worm called the Sasamgor worm that infiltrates cedar wood and causes it to rot from within. My Sasmagor. So what is that? What does the metaphor refer to among the Jewish people? So Amar Rabbi Abba Baskol. It refers to the fact that instead of prophecy abounding in the Second Temple era, the Jews had an inferior form of divine revelation, which was called the Baskol, the heavenly voice, which was really just a shadow of prophecy. Kedetanya mishamesu neviim ha'achron m'chages Zechariah malachi nistalka ruach hakodesh miYisrael be'adayin hayu mishtamshim bevaskol. That when the final prophets passed away, that they lived into the Second Temple period, but they died within the first generation, then ruach hakodesh, the divine spirit, was removed from Israel, and they only could have some pale remnant of it, which was the Baskol, the heavenly voice, that sometimes we see in the Gemara, like a heavenly voice calls out, with the Machlokas, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, says, Elu velu divrei Elokim Chaim, and so forth. V'reish Lakish, mi mishtoi bahadi Rabba bar Barchana. So the Gemara now says, but wait a minute, Reish Lakish is publicly seen speaking with Rabba bar Barchana? How could that be? Uma Rebbe Elazar d'Moradara d'Yisrael hava v'lo hava mishtoi Reish Lakish bahadei. That Rebbe Elazar was the Morada Asra of Eretz Yisrael. And Reish Lakish wouldn't even speak with him. Now, when it says he wouldn't speak with him, it doesn't mean he wouldn't speak with him in the Beis Medrash. You find machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rebbe Elazar all the time in the Gemara, that they're speaking with each other. It means that he wouldn't speak public with him out in public in the marketplace. And the reason is why? Because Deman de Mishtoi Reish Lakish Bahadei B'Shuk Yavu Le Iska Below Sahadi. Because anytime someone would be seen talking to Reish Lakish publicly, people would assume that the great Reish Lakish would only speak to someone truly trustworthy, and they would extend that person credit. And Reish Lakish, I guess, must have gotten burnt one time that he was seen speaking with someone who was a little bit unsavory, and people started to cast aspersions. So therefore, Reish Lakish had a policy: whenever he walked publicly anywhere, he kept his head down and just kept walking, wouldn't speak to anyone. So if he didn't even speak to Rabbi Elazar publicly, so then Bahadi Rabbi Bar Barchana Mishtai, then how could he speak to Rabbi Bar Barchana, who was a junior sage from Bavel, who didn't even know that well? So Amar Rav Papa Shadi Gavra Beinayu, O Reish Lakish Hava Uzeiri, O Rabbi Bar Barchana Hava Rabbi Elazar. The answer is, we got the story wrong. There were two people in the story. It was either Reish Lakish and Ze'eri, who was a senior sage from Bavel, and that's certainly understandable that Reish Lakish would speak to a senior sage, or the story happened with Rabbi Bar Barchana and Rabbi Elazar, who was swimming, and not Reish Lakish, and that would resolve the problem. Ki asa lakami to Rabbi Yochanan. So anyway, when the swimmer, whether it was Reish Lakish or Rabbi Elazar, when he came back and told Rabbi Yochanan what he had told Rabbi Bar Barchana or Ze'eri, whichever one it was, he told him that I told him that if the Babylonians had come back, the prophecy would have abounded again in the Second Temple. Amar le lav hainu taima. He says, He says, that's not the reason. Even if the Jews would have come back en masse to build the Second Temple, the divine presence still would not have been brought back. And the reason is, Afal gav the Yafta Lukim Liyefes, Ein hashchina shora ela b'ahalei shem. That the Torah says that God will provide beauty for Yefes, but He will only dwell in the tents of Shem. And what that means is that because Yefes built the second temple, God will not dwell in that temple. God will only dwell in the temple that Shem built, that Solomon built, who was a Shemite, but He would not dwell in the building that Yefes built. Yefes, descendants of Yefes, as we'll see tomorrow, is Paras, is Persia. And because King Koresh was the one who let the Jews build the second temple, and he was Persian, that's why God's divine presence cannot rest there. Now, we're going to hold it here for today, but I just wanted to add one point, and that is that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari points out that he goes like Reish Lakish. He says that if the Jews had come back en masse, we would have had the second temple abounding with prophecy. And not only that, but Rav Soloveitchik, in his famous essay Kol Dodi Dofek, which he wrote shortly after the founding of the State of Israel, also cites this Gemara, and he says that it's now incumbent upon Jews to come back en masse to Eretz Yisrael so that the Shekhinah can come back and that we can see you're coming back to Zion. So have a wonderful day on that.